The corridor of the Kang estate had never been a place where silence meant safety. It was a place where silence meant someone was about to lose everything. Amara Ndlovu understood this. She had spent 8 months learning the difference between Kang Jae-Min's silences, the cold, transactional ones he used in boardrooms, and the rarer, more dangerous ones that meant he was no longer performing. This silence was neither. This silence had no category she had prepared for. She did not look up from her phone screen. The boarding pass glowed against the dark of the corridor, white and final, Seoul to Johannesburg, departing 9:45 a.m. The handle of her carry-on was smooth and solid under her palm, the most uncomplicated thing in the room. One step forward, she told herself. Just walk. She did not walk. He was standing at the far end of the corridor. She didn't need to count the meters between them to know he hadn't moved since she emerged from the elevator. Kang Jae-Min stood exactly as he always stood, all contained, immovable authority, the tailored black suit and deep burgundy pocket square as precise on him as a uniform, every line of his posture radiating the particular stillness of a man who had never once in his life been required to wait for anything. The faint scar along his jaw caught the low amber light of the hallway. His dark eyes were fixed on her with the kind of focus he usually reserved for rivals who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating him. He was not her rival. He was simply in her way. The flight boards in 4 hours, Mr. Kang, Amara said. Her South African accent was unhurried, clear, the voice of a woman who had translated high-stakes negotiations in 4 languages without her hands shaking once. It did not shake now. I've completed my contractual obligations. Everything has been filed and handed over. There is no professional reason for this conversation. The corridor held its breath. Kang Jae-Min, the man whose name alone cleared rooms in 3 countries, whose empire ran on fear and cold precision, whose expression had remained unreadable through boardroom wars and back-alley consequences alike, did not move. Did not speak. The burgundy pocket square sat like a single note of warmth against the severity of everything he was, and Amara felt the charge between them the way she always had, like standing too close to something that had not yet decided whether to burn. She finally looked up. Fully. Meeting his eyes the way she always had, directly, without apology, without the studied deference that every other person in his orbit performed without thinking. The most feared man in Seoul looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who did not know what to do with his own hands. Are you going to move, Jae-Min? She said softly, the formal address dropping for the first and only time, or are you finally going to say the thing you have been not saying for 8 months? The silence that followed was not empty. It was the loudest thing she had ever heard. 8 months earlier, Amara Ndlovu had walked into the Kang estate the same way she walked into every room that was designed to make her feel small, with her shoulders back, her portfolio under one arm, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she was the most qualified person in it. The estate itself was a study in controlled intimidation. Black marble floors that reflected light like still water. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River, the city glittering beyond the glass like something that had been purchased and arranged. The furniture was sparse and deliberate, every piece chosen not for warmth but for weight, the kind of interior that communicated, without a single word, that the man who lived here did not require comfort. He required compliance. The negotiation waiting for her in the East Wing was one of the most complex cross-continental trade arrangements she had ever been contracted to interpret, 3 delegations, 4 languages, and a web of financial interests that had been quietly hostile to each other for the better part of a decade. She had reviewed 600 pages of briefing documents on the flight from Johannesburg. She was ready. What she had not reviewed was him. Kang Jae-Min entered the room the way a change in weather enters. Not announced, simply suddenly present, the atmosphere shifting around him before anyone had consciously registered his arrival. He was in his early 30s, though something about the gray at his temples and the absolute stillness of his expression suggested a man who had lived several lifetimes inside that frame. The tailored black suit. The deep burgundy pocket square, the single concession to color in an otherwise monochrome presence. The faint scar along his jaw that no one in the room was impolite enough to look at directly. Everyone in the room, without appearing to, leaned slightly away from him. Amara did not. She introduced herself in clean, professional Korean, then pivoted without pause to outline a translation discrepancy she had identified in the preliminary documents, a phrasing error in the Congolese trade addendum that, left uncorrected, would expose the entire agreement to a legal challenge within 6 months. She did not soften it. She did not frame it as a suggestion. The room went very quiet. Kang Jae-Min, who had not looked at her since she began speaking, looked at her then. It lasted exactly 1 second longer than professional acknowledgement required. His expression did not change, not the jaw, not the eyes, not the carefully neutral set of his mouth. But he reached for the addendum. "Correct it," he said. And that was the beginning. 8 months, distilled, looked something like this. It looked like the 3rd week of October, when the Congolese delegation ran 4 hours over schedule and the estate's conference wing emptied out slowly, person by person, until it was only the two of them left on opposite sides of a long mahogany table covered in documents neither of them had finished reviewing. Amara worked. Jae-Min worked. The city hummed beyond the windows. At some point, without discussion, one of his staff had left tea on the credenza, 2 cups, and neither of them remarked on it. She didn't know how long they sat like that, the silence between them the particular kind that didn't ask to be filled. When she finally gathered her files and said goodnight, he said it back. Just that. But she was 3 corridors away before her pulse returned to its normal register. It looked like the corridor outside the East Wing on a Tuesday in December, narrow enough that passing someone required a brief, unavoidable proximity. She had a stack of translated briefs in both arms. He was walking in the opposite direction, 2 of his lieutenants half a step behind him, mid-conversation in the clipped shorthand of men who conducted serious business at all hours. He stepped aside for her, a small thing, unremarkable, except that his hand came up instinctively as she passed, hovering at the small of her back for less than a second, touching nothing, just present in the air like a question he hadn't meant to ask. She kept walking. So did he. Neither of them mentioned it, because there was nothing, technically, to mention. It looked like the morning in February when a rival delegation attempted to reframe a clause in terms that would have quietly gutted the agreement's equity provisions, and their lead counsel spoke over Amara's translation with the particular confidence of a man who had decided her presence was decorative. She waited precisely 4 seconds, she had counted, later, before she retranslated the clause herself, correctly, then laid out the legal consequence of the rival's version in 3 languages, consecutively, without notes. The room shifted. Jae-Min, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply waited until the rival counsel finished his objection, then deferred to her translation on the record. She had not expected that. She thought about it for longer than was professionally warranted. And it looked like one evening in late March when he said something dry and understated about the absurdity of a particular negotiating tactic, delivered so quietly that only she caught it, and she laughed. Genuinely, briefly, the kind of laugh that escapes before it can be managed. He didn't smile, exactly. But something in his expression shifted, like a door opening a centimeter in a room that had always been sealed. The rest of that evening, the air in the estate felt different. Both of them pretended it didn't. It happened on a Wednesday, which felt wrong in retrospect. Wednesdays were unremarkable days, midweek, mid-afternoon, the light through the estate's west-facing windows the flat, neutral gray of a Seoul spring that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. Nothing about the day had signaled that it would be the kind that rearranged things. Amara knocked twice on the open door of his study and waited for him to look up from the documents on his desk before she stepped inside. This was the protocol she had established in the first week and maintained without exception, a small, consistent boundary that said, without words, I work with you, not for you. He had noticed. He had never remarked on it. She set a neatly bound handover file on the corner of his desk. The final translated records for the Dakar addendum are all included, she said. Everything is indexed, cross-referenced, and ready for your legal team. The last outstanding clause was confirmed this morning. The negotiation is complete. Jae-Min set down his pen. He looked at the file, then at her. My contract concludes at the end of the week, Amara continued, her voice carrying the same clean, professional cadence it always did, the voice that had navigated 4 languages across 8 months without once losing its composure. I've arranged a debrief with your chief counsel for Thursday afternoon. My flight back to Johannesburg is Friday at 9:45. She paused, just briefly. I wanted to tell you directly. You've been a demanding client, but a fair one. I'm grateful for the work. She smiled, the professional one, precise and warm, and turned to leave. Jae-Min did not respond. Not because he had decided not to. Because somewhere between Friday and Johannesburg, the part of him responsible for forming words had simply stopped. He was aware, in a distant and clinical way, that his breath had miscalculated itself, come in slightly wrong, not quite enough, like a system encountering an input it hadn't been built to process. He was aware that his hand, resting on the desk, had not moved. That the pen beside it had not moved. That the room was continuing to exist around him with complete indifference to the fact that something had just shifted inside his chest in a way that had no name in any language he had ever operated in. Friday. 9:45. He heard her footsteps cross the marble of the corridor. He heard the quiet, definitive sound of the study door drawing closed behind her. He looked at the handover file on the corner of his desk, bound, indexed, complete. The final, organized evidence that she had done everything she came to do and had absolutely no professional reason to stay. Kang Jae-Min, who had never once in his life been caught unprepared, sat in his study while the gray afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor. He did not move for a very long time. She had packed efficiently, the way she did everything, without sentimentality, without excess. One carry-on, one portfolio case, the small personal items that had quietly accumulated in the guest suite over 8 months reduced back to nothing, the room returned to the impersonal elegance it had worn before she arrived. She did a final sweep at 10:30, turned off the lamp, and walked toward the elevator with the particular lightness of a woman who had closed something cleanly. He was standing in the corridor. Not pacing. Not positioned near the elevator with some manufactured reason to be there. Simply standing, midway down the hall, in the low amber light, still in the day's black suit though the hour was well past anything that required it. His hands were at his sides. His expression was the careful, neutral one she had spent 8 months learning to read past. Amara slowed. Stopped. She looked at him, the luggage at her feet, the boarding pass already pulled up on her phone, and waited. Whatever this was, she would not be the one to make it easier. Mr. Kang, she said, when the silence had gone on long enough. I have an early flight. He said nothing. But he did not move. She took one step forward. Then another. She stopped when it became clear that he had no intention of stepping aside, not aggressively, not with any of the cold authority she had watched him use to end arguments and clear rooms. Just stillness. Just the quiet, uncharacteristic fact of him, standing between her and the door with nothing to justify it. Jae-Min. His name, again, without the formality. It landed differently in the corridor than it had in the study. Move. He looked at her then, fully, in the way he almost never allowed himself, and something behind his expression shifted. Not breaking, not yet. But the marble developing its first, irreversible fracture. I can't, he said. The words came out with none of the precision he usually wore like armor. Just 2 syllables, stripped of strategy, sitting raw in the air between them. Amara felt something move through her chest that she had no intention of naming. "Why?" she asked quietly. The corridor held its breath. The city continued its indifferent glitter beyond the far windows. Kang Jae-Min, who commanded boardrooms and silenced rivals and had built an empire on the principle that no one would ever see past his surface, opened his mouth. And for the first time in 8 months, he had no answer that wasn't the truth. What came out of him was not a speech. It was not the kind of declaration that had been rehearsed or calculated or shaped into something presentable. It arrived the way things arrive when a structure that has been under pressure for a very long time finally gives, not all at once, but in pieces, each one costing something. "In 8 months, Jae-Min said, his voice lower than she had ever heard it, you are the only person in any room I have wanted to impress." He stopped. As if the sentence had surprised him on its way out. As if he was hearing it at the same time she was and was only now understanding it to be true. Not the delegations. Not the rival boards. Not the men who come in here convinced they can take something from me. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You." Correcting a clause in a document that a room full of lawyers had signed off on. Looking at me like my opinion of your competence was entirely beside the point. Amara did not speak. She held his words the way she would hold something fragile and unfamiliar, carefully, without squeezing, waiting to understand what she was holding. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the first unguarded gesture she had ever seen from him, and something in the motion undid another layer of the composure he had been maintaining. "I have reviewed that Dakar addendum 14 times, he said. "I have not reviewed it once without hearing your voice in the margin notes." He looked away briefly, as if the admission required a moment of privacy even as he was making it. "The evening you laughed, in March, the remark about the Zurich delegation, I have replayed that more times than I have reviewed a single contract this quarter. That is not a figure of speech." The corridor was very quiet. "The thought of you landing in Johannesburg," he continued, and here his voice changed, dropped into something she had no framework for, because she had never heard Kang Jae-Min sound like this, "and building a life that has nothing to do with me, that is the first thing in my adult life that has felt like actual fear." He stopped. He did not reach for her. He did not move to close the distance between them. He simply stood in the amber light with everything he had just said sitting uncollected in the air between them, raw and slightly broken and entirely without strategy. Amara looked at him for a long, measured moment. She believed him. That was not the question. The question was what a woman who had spent a lifetime protecting herself from exactly this did with the truth when it finally arrived looking this honest. She had not yet decided. The silence after his confession was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that thinks. Amara set her portfolio case down slowly, with the deliberate care of a woman who needed her hands free to say something that mattered. She looked at him, not the way she had looked at him across negotiating tables, professionally and with appropriate distance, but directly, the way she had always privately allowed herself to when he wasn't watching. She saw the confession still sitting unguarded in his expression. She saw what it had cost him. She did not let that cost become her responsibility. "I believe you," she said. "That is not the question." Something moved through his eyes. Not relief, he was too controlled for relief, even now. But the particular attention of a man who understood that what came next would determine everything. "The question," Amara continued, her voice steady and unhurried, "is whether what you're describing is a partnership, or a possession with more considerate language." She held his gaze without apology. "I have spent my career in rooms built by powerful men, Jae-Min. I know what it looks like when one of them decides he wants something. I know the difference between being chosen and being acquired. And I will not spend whatever comes next trying to figure out which one this is from inside your estate, on your payroll, inside the architecture of your world." He said nothing. But he was listening in the way he listened when something was important, completely, without interruption, without the slight impatience that colored his attention in lesser conversations. 60 days, she said. I will delay the flight. I will find my own apartment and my own work in this city, and I will do that independently, without your assistance and without your interference. She paused. If you want me to choose Seoul, to choose you, then show me who Kang Jae-Min is when he has no empire to stand behind. No titles. No leverage. No infrastructure. Her voice remained warm, but the clarity in it was absolute. Earn it like a man, not like a dynasty. The corridor held them both for one last suspended moment. Then Amara picked up her carry-on, tucked her portfolio under her arm, and walked toward the elevator with the same unhurried certainty with which she had walked into this estate 8 months ago. This time, Kang Jae-Min stepped aside. She did not look back. But as the elevator doors parted, she heard him exhale behind her, quiet, unguarded, the first completely uncontrolled sound she had ever heard him make. It was, she thought, a beginning. The apartment in Itaewon was small and entirely hers. 4th floor, 1 bedroom, a window above the kitchen sink that looked out over a street that never fully quieted. She had chosen it herself, signed the lease herself, and spent the first evening sitting on the floor eating takeout from the place downstairs, surrounded by nothing that belonged to anyone else. It felt, she decided, exactly right. She built her days deliberately. A consulting contract with a trade firm in Mapogu, 3 mornings a week. A Korean language class she had been postponing for months, now scheduled and attended without renegotiation. Long walks through neighborhoods she had never had time to explore during 8 months of living inside the estate's polished orbit. She was constructing a version of Seoul that was hers rather than borrowed, and the work of it was quietly satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with him. She thought about him anyway. Across the city, Kang Jae-Min was experiencing something he had no procedural framework for, the complete absence of a viable strategy. Every structure he had ever used to obtain something, leverage, acquisition, delegation, calculated pressure, was unavailable to him by the terms of his own agreement. He had given her his word. He intended to keep it. What he had not anticipated was how entirely his word would strip him of everything he knew how to do. So he tried other things. Imperfectly, without precedent. On the 9th day, a container of jollof rice from a West African restaurant in Mapogu appeared outside her apartment door, warm, with no note. She had mentioned the restaurant once, briefly, in passing, 3 months ago in a conversation about Johannesburg. She stood in her doorway for a long moment before bringing it inside. On the 22nd day, she came home to find a slim hardcover on her welcome mat, a first edition collection of South African poetry, the cover worn with the respectful age of something that had been read before. His name was written inside the front cover in his precise, minimal hand. Nothing else. On the 38th day, she gave a guest lecture at a trade symposium in Gangnam. She was midway through her opening remarks when she noticed him. Back row. Dark coat. No entourage, no table placement, no visible reason to be there. He was not looking at his phone. He was listening with the same complete, unguarded attention he had given her in the corridor. He left before it ended, quietly, without approaching her. She finished her lecture. She gathered her notes. She allowed herself, for the first time, to smile about it on the walk home. By the 54th day, Amara had stopped arguing with herself about it. Not all at once. It had happened the way most honest reckonings happen, gradually, then with a quiet inevitability that made the resistance feel, in retrospect, like a great deal of effort spent on a conclusion that had always been waiting. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going warm beside her and the slim poetry collection open in front of her. She had read it twice now, slowly, in the way it deserved, when she realized she had not thought about leaving in several days. Not suppressed the thought. Simply not had it. She considered that for a while. Then she got up, refilled her coffee, and looked at the evidence. Not the corridor confession, which had been extraordinary and therefore easy to hold at arm's length, to examine as an event rather than a truth. She looked instead at the ordinary things. The jollof rice, still warm, left without a note by a man who had no template for that kind of gesture and had made it anyway. The book, chosen with a specificity that required him to have listened to her, really listened, the way people listen when something matters to them, during a conversation she had almost forgotten having. The back row of a symposium, a dark coat, no entourage. Sitting in a room where he held no power and announced no presence, simply because she was in it. She thought about the corridor in December, his hand hovering at the small of her back, touching nothing. The tea left on the credenza during a late negotiation, 2 cups, unremarked upon. The moment he had deferred to her translation in front of a rival delegation without hesitation, without ego, because she was right and that was the only thing that mattered to him. 8 months of small, unscripted things. 2 months of smaller, more deliberate ones. This was not infatuation. Infatuation did not require this kind of patience, this kind of consistency, this kind of willingness to be seen failing at something. What she had been carefully managing since the first week inside the Kang estate, the thing she had kept professionally folded and set aside like a document she wasn't authorized to open, was simply the recognition that she had never met anyone quite like him. And that he, against every reasonable expectation, had never met anyone quite like her. The 60th day was in 6 days. Amara closed the poetry collection, her thumb resting on the cover for a moment. She was ready. He was early. Not by much, 7 minutes, perhaps 8, but she noticed at the moment she opened the door, because Kang Jae-Min had spent 8 months being precisely, deliberately punctual, and the 7 minutes told her something that no carefully constructed entrance could have. He had been standing in her hallway, in an ordinary Itaewon apartment building with no marble floors and no amber estate lighting, and he had arrived before he meant to because somewhere in the final hours of 60 days, the calculation had slipped. He was alone. Dark coat, no pocket square, no entourage waiting in black cars at the curb below. Nothing about him announced the empire. He looked, simply, like a man standing at a door he very much hoped would open. It had. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking, the way people look at each other when words feel like a smaller instrument than the occasion requires. Then he reached into his coat and held out a small wooden box. Rectangular, unvarnished, the warm reddish-brown of indigenous South African timber, she recognized it before she even took it from him, the particular grain of Mozambique wood, something from home. Her hands were steady as she opened it. The earrings were simple and extraordinary, hand-formed gold, crafted in the curved, deliberate style of a Johannesburg artisan who understood that beauty did not require excess. On the inner face of the clasp, engraved in letters small enough to require intention to read, was a single line from the poetry collection. The one she had returned to most. The line she had assumed he couldn't have known she'd found. She looked up at him. "I had someone photograph every page you dog-eared," he said quietly, and there was nothing calculated in his expression, nothing strategic. Just the faint, unguarded quality that had been appearing more frequently in the past 60 days, assembling itself slowly into something that looked, on him, remarkably like openness. "I don't want your return flight cancelled, Amara. I want to be the reason you never need it." She held the earrings in her palm for a moment. Then she put them on, unhurried, certain, the same way she did everything. She picked up her keys. She stepped out of the apartment and pulled the door closed behind her, and she did not look back at the space she was leaving because what was ahead of her had her complete attention. They walked to the elevator side by side. Not into his empire. Into the city, shared, unclaimed, beginning. The doors opened. They stepped in together. Outside, Seoul was luminous. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true love stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places.